Greetings and welcome to today's GRE Reading Comprehension class by Galvanize Test Prep. Let's begin with a quick recap of what we did last time. So, in the previous lesson, we looked at the different purposes an RC passage could have and their respective indicators, right? We learned that every piece of text has a purpose. And when it comes to reading comprehension passages, there are 6 common purposes, which are to speculate, predict or hypothesize, to critique, to compare, defend, debate, and describe. We also touched upon indicator words and phrases in the passage, certain words and phrases that will help you identify which of these purposes this passage is written for, right? And then we also looked at the fact that every part of a text has a function, every sentence has a function, every paragraph has a function, and understanding the function of parts of text helps us arrive at the structure of a passage. So a quick recap of different types of sentence functions which will help us with today's class is, for example, sentences could introduce a concept, make a claim, elaborate on a point previously made, provide examples, alternatives, support, oppose a point, provide evidence, or draw conclusions or inferences. So, it's important for you to keep your antenna up and make sure that you are conscious of the purposes of sentences, and these indicator phrases will help you spot the purposes of sentences. Now that you have the ability to arrive at the why of the passage, which is the primary purpose, and in turn the what of the passage, which is its main idea, you already have a crucial weapon in your arsenal. And this weapon can be compared to a bow. Something like that. But without the arrows, the bow may not be very useful. So the next weapon you're going to add to your arsenal is going to be finding the structure. Think of this as an arrow. The main idea and the primary purpose are kind of complementary, right? And similarly, the main idea, primary purpose on one hand and the structure on the other hand are also complementary. One can help you understand the other better. Sometimes the primary purpose can help you arrive at the structure easily, and sometimes finding the structure is all you need to do to understand the purpose or the main idea of the passage. So, when it comes to understanding structures, now remember, every type of story has its own element, right? It has made up of a bunch of elements, and we are going to use an example of movies. Every movie does have its own structure, doesn't it? For example, a typical superhero movie might have a structure that goes through all of these different stages. Similarly, if you have a romantic comedy movie, that movie might have a structure that goes through these stages, right? So every production, every movie, every book has its own structure. And similarly, every reading comprehension passage also has its own structure, right? So let's actually come to the popular reading comprehension passage structures that we at Galvanize have identified on the exams. Now, stories and movies are made of events, right? So if you were to narrate the story of a movie you recently watched to a friend, you would visualize and narrate the order of events and actions that occurred in the movie, right? Now, similarly, you're going to do the same thing here, right? So based on the events that happened, you might call the movie a comedy, a tragedy, a thriller, an action movie, a superhero movie, a horror movie. Similarly, if you identify the events that happen in the passage, then you are going to be able to arrive at a broad structure of the passage. All right, so there are different passage structures, just like there are different types of movies or genres of movies, and we are going to present to you 5 broad structures under which almost any GRE passage can be fit into. Okay, so each structure can come associated with a primary purpose as well. That's something you want to keep in mind. So the first structure that we are going to look at of reading comprehension passages is the argument structure. So in an argument, the passage will make a claim and provide evidence to support that claim. Right? Because an argument is essentially to put forth a point, to convince someone, to persuade someone. Right? So that's what the passage is going to do. For example, Shakespeare, or let's say you take Shakespeare, a claim that Shakespeare was not a single author, and then providing evidence to support that claim. So in other words, the passage would give you context to say that sometimes people, when talking about different authors and how it's possible to ascertain it, and they might make a claim that Shakespeare was not a single author. In other words, Shakespeare's works were written by different people. It's just a claim, okay? I'm not stating any fact here. It's just a claim. And then the passage might provide evidence on this and come to a conclusion. All right? So this is one kind of structure, the argument structure. Let's look at another kind of RC passage structure common on the GRE, the problem structure. So what do we mean by a problem, right? Problem is all about highlighting an issue, pointing out a flaw, and so on. So essentially the passage will identify a problem in a particular context and usually, but not always, provide a solution to that problem, right? So because if you look at the structure of a problem RC passage, there will be a context, which is the premise or some assumptions. Then they will introduce the problem and talk about the cause, the impact, and the potential solution, right? Because after all, a problem is about highlighting an issue, perhaps pointing out a flaw, and then providing a solution in some cases. For example, a passage might talk about a problem in terms of how a particular language evolved into several different languages over a long period of time, and then point out that we can't really pinpoint the exact time period in which a new language emerged from the old language, right? So that could be the problem. And the cause could be that language evolution happens so slowly, and in addition, one needs a lot of early scriptures that are still intact today in order to track these changes. So these could be parts of a passage that deals with a problem, right? So this is another kind of structure on GRE reading comprehension passages, the problem structure. Let's look at the third kind of structure that's common to GRE passages, which is the transition. Now, in a transition, we essentially are pointing out a change in something, right? So the passage will point out a shortcoming or a gap in an existing theory, and then provide an alternative theory or possibility, right? So a transition is about pointing out a change in something to highlight the need for a change. And usually the structure of the passage would flow like first the old theory, then the new theory, and then recommending perhaps the reasons for change as to why we should modify our understanding to adopt the new theory. An example of a transition structure could be a passage that deals with belief. For example, early scientists believed that the Earth was in the center of the solar system, but after some observations, it has been discovered that the sun is in the center of the solar system, right? So you can see how it transitioned from an old theory to a new theory and then reasons. So it need not always come in this order. It could be something in another order, but essentially you will find all of these elements present in a particular structure. The fourth type of structure that's common on RC passages is the debate structure. So in a debate, what do? We typically analyze two sides of an argument, and then usually you would support a particular side, right? So a debate often throws light on a topic that is controversial, looks at both sides, and then typically supports one of the two sides, right? So, for example, the passage could be structured like this. A debate passage might introduce the topic or the context, right? So often you will find that passages do begin with the context, just like you have an argument and problem and so on. And then there would be an argument for, an argument against, and then the author's side. And sometimes the author might not take an explicit stance among these two. The author might take a slightly different stance, a nuanced position, or even say that the author is not convinced by either of these and looking for more data that will shed light on which of these two are correct. So which of these two is correct. So it will, but typically it kind of goes like a debate, and hence we call it a debate structure. An example of a reading comprehension passage that has a debate structure could be a passage that deals with whether some part of the human body, such as the appendix, currently has a function or not. Right? So they would talk about, maybe one paragraph could talk about how it has a function, some studies suggest that, and another part of the passage could talk about how certain studies suggest that it has no function, and then finally the third paragraph, the author might conclude what his or her opinion is. Right? Okay. And the final type of common reading comprehension passage structure that you will encounter on the GRE is called a description or a describe structure. So a describe is actually the most, I would say, the innocent and the most easygoing of all, because it describes a phenomenon. It could be a scientific phenomenon, it could be a sociological or an economic phenomenon, history, and it can be from any field, but it is about how something works, right? It doesn't cast judgment or debate or criticize anything or argue, but it just describes something happening, right? So the description or the describe structure typically goes through, again, introduce the topic or the context, some features of this phenomenon that they're talking about, often elaborate on these features by giving minor details or examples, and then come to a particular conclusion. For example, a passage might talk about the mechanism of how a volcanic eruption takes place, but it doesn't have to get into the intricacies of the process, right? Some passages might get into the intricacies as well. So it depends at what level of detail the author wants to describe the phenomenon in the particular passage, right? So these are 5 different types of passage structures that are common on the GRE: the argument, the problem, the transition, the debate, and describe. Now, all of these 5 are associated with their own passage purpose as well. For example, the purpose of an argument passage is to make a claim and come to a conclusion, right? Similarly, a problem is again about a problem passage has the purpose of pointing out a problem and recommending a solution. The purpose of a transition passage is to come up with a new theory, explain a new theory, and give a reason as to why we must transition or change to this theory. Similarly, the purpose of a debate passage is obviously to debate a particular claim, and the purpose of a describe passage is to describe certain features of a phenomenon and to elaborate. So you can see how the structures of a passage and the purpose are so closely linked, right? The purpose could be to argue, to point out a problem in this case, or to recommend a transition, debate, or describe. And therefore, these structures also mirror the purposes. So it's very, very important for you to understand the mapping between the structure of a passage and the kinds of the way the passage would flow, or what would be the elements of a passage. So please take a look at these and understand how they are different from one another. You will be using these to identify the structure of passages. All right. So it's very important for you to be comfortable with structures, but it will take time. So it's all right if it's going to take a bit of time. We are going to have a lot of practice, and that will help us get comfortable. Now, before we actually try out these things and apply what we've learned, I would like to point out the following. First is, while most GRE passages kind of neatly fall into one of these 5 structure categories, we would like to caution you that these 5 structures are not watertight compartments. All right. These structures give you a fair understanding of how the stories are structured in a passage, or how the passage is organized, but these are not absolute watertight compartments. There might be other structures as well, or there might be a mixture of structures. The second thing is that you need to remember that the order of these elements within a structure, for example, context, claim, evidence, conclusion, this order does not always have to be the same. Maybe they might talk about the evidence first, right? Or give you the context and then the evidence and then make the claim. So the order can change, because a story can be constructed in any manner, but still, even if the order changes, you should be able to loosely map the passage to one of these categories of structures. And finally, not all elements within a structure will necessarily be present in a passage that belongs to a particular structure. Okay, for example, the problem structure need not always contain a solution. Maybe they will just stop with the impact, right? So for all you know, the author might be pointing out that, hey, there is this problem, and talking about the impact of the problem, and perhaps the author anticipates someone else to find a solution and does not provide the solution themselves. And just keep in mind that while all of this information is given to you, it's very valuable, it's very useful, one can see a passage through many lenses, right? So what is important is to develop the ability to spot the passage structure when you read a passage. Okay, you should be able to spot what structure a particular passage has. All right, it's very important, and it is, once you build this ability, build this skill, you will find that it becomes increasingly easier for you to understand what's happening in the passage and also answer all the questions correctly. Now let's take everything that we have learned so far and put them together and apply them to an actual reading comprehension passage. So what have we learned so far? The galvanized formula for reading comprehension. The first step is that you will skim the passage, which means you will understand the context, that's the broad field and the specific topic of the passage. Then the structure of the passage, and usually it would be one among the 5 structures that we have identified so far. We will identify the main idea of the passage and the primary purpose and the tone of the author. All right. So once you do the skimming, it's only after that you will proceed to answer the questions. And to answer the questions, these are the steps. We understand the task of the question, locate the relevant portion from the passage that will help us answer the question, anticipate what the answer could be, and eliminate the wrong answer choices to arrive at the correct one. All right. So it's very important that you understand all of these steps. The skim, which means the context, structure, main idea or the primary purpose, and the tone. And then understand, locate, anticipate, and eliminate. If you would like a handy acronym, you can think of SULAE or SULAE. Skim, understand, locate, anticipate, and eliminate. All right, so keep these in mind. And within skim, again, you have 4 parts, which is the context, the structure, either the main idea or the primary purpose, and the tone of the author. To understand the context of a passage, you just need to know what the passage is going to be talking about. And for that, you do not need to read the entire passage just yet. You just need to read the first few lines, because the first few lines will tell you what topic the passage will be dealing with. Alright, so let's read the first few lines, or the first sentence in this case. Bats are dependent on echolocation calls for several vital activities, including foraging, orientation, and navigation. But this reliance in our modern world makes them vulnerable to many sensory traps that lead to dangerous errors in interpreting their environment. Well, reading the first few lines, we see that this passage talks about bats. In fact, the broad field of the passage, you could say, is biology, and within that the specific topic is about bats, and more specifically a problem faced by bats. How do we know that the bats are facing a problem? Because it says that the bats are dependent on something, but this dependency, this reliance, makes them vulnerable, right? So we see that the bats are in some kind of danger. So there is some problem that they are facing. Okay, so remember that it's important for you to get this context of any passage as soon as you start reading the passage, because the context helps to get our mind ready for new material, right? Perhaps just before this passage, you might have been solving a discrete question, maybe a text completion question with 3 blanks dealing with the American Civil War, and then suddenly you're confronted with this passage on bats, and you will find that taking the time to establish the context of the passage helps your mind switch to the new context, right? And it makes it easy to read and process this particular passage. Okay, so I do want to point out once again that getting the comfort level with the context is extremely important. So we have first established the context. Next, we have to find the functions of sentences. All right, so how do we do that? Remember that it's so important to get the structure of the passage, and to get the structure you need to get the functions of sentences. So let's now continue and let's begin skimming through the passage to make note of the structure, the main idea, the tone, and any indicator words, if any, and so on. The indicator words will help you find the functions of sentences, which will in turn help us get the idea of the overall structure of the passage. So let's first focus again on the first sentence here. Bats are dependent on echolocation calls for several vital activities, including foraging, orientation, and navigation. But this reliance in our modern world makes them vulnerable to many sensory traps that lead to dangerous errors in interpreting their environment. It's quite a heavy sentence, it's a long sentence, and it looks like a lot of things are happening. So let's take it slowly. Right, let's first look at the indicator words and some other keywords to identify the purpose of the sentence. And you don't have to break your head over the word for word meaning of this sentence, right? All we need to do is to skim the sentence to identify a few major points. For example, if you're worried that you don't know the meaning of echolocation, or for that matter, the meaning of foraging, it's totally fine. Okay, don't panic and don't keep thinking about this in the middle of the exam. Oh my god, I don't know the meaning of foraging. Well, it's not going to help you, and it's not like the meanings of these unknown words will magically dawn upon you out of nowhere when you're taking the exam. All right, so it's okay if you don't know the meanings of certain words, and I want to reassure you that this is exactly where the galvanized strategy is useful. Because in our strategy, we advise you to focus on what the entire sentence is saying, in what's the purpose or the function of the sentence. And to find the purpose of the sentence, look at the indicator word. For example, look at the word but, right? There's a clear turning point here. And these words are very important because they always bring in some action to what might otherwise be a bland story. And look at this vulnerable, right? Makes them vulnerable, makes the bats vulnerable. Words like traps, danger, dangerous errors. So don't these words signify that the bats are in some sort of a problem? Right? So isn't this good enough a trigger for us to identify the rough structure of the passage and eventually actively skim through the rest of the passage to find the missing parts? Right? We're already kind of getting the feeling that the passage might be a problem structure passage. Right? Remember, we looked at 5 possible structures. You could have the argument structure, the problem structure, debate, transition, and describe. So it feels like this passage is going to be a problem structure, and we can continue right now. There's something I would like to point out, however, before I move on. It's okay to know the meanings of it's okay to not know the meanings of some words like these, but it's definitely not okay to not know the meanings of some other words. For example, if someone doesn't understand the meaning of the word vulnerable, then you're going to have a problem with the passage. All right? It's not okay to say I don't understand the meanings of so many words. Now because there are some words that you can't afford to not know the meanings, and you better know their meanings. In fact, vocabulary is a part of the foundation for the GRE, and so you must take time to work on it so you build a solid vocabulary. And here is where I would like to draw your attention to our unique course structure at Galvanize. So we have something called a study plan, and the study plan incorporates vocabulary tasks as well. Right, so we do have a vocabulary app. It happens to be one of the world's highest rated vocabulary apps. It's available on both the Android and the iOS platforms. And the way your GRE course is planned is such that when you go through the study plan and you look at the tasks that you need to do for each day, you will find that some of these tasks are vocabulary tasks. So you can head over to our vocabulary app and therefore you will learn words gradually over a period of time using the right pedagogy, as opposed to mugging up these words and committing them to your memory by heart in the last minute. All right. And I would like to point out that the so-called N number of alphabetically sorted GRE words list is as good as a placebo. It's like a sugar pill. It only makes you feel like you're learning something, those kinds of lists, word lists which are sorted, and you might know that some of them might the way you learn it, you shouldn't learn words by memory, because that might not come in handy during the test. Okay, learning words in a list format is not that helpful. You have to learn words in a particular way in context. The way we learn words when, in English, for example, or in any language, you learn words by context, right? You encounter these words in a context and you encounter them and you are able to associate or connect the meaning of the word to the other, of the unknown word to the other meanings of to the meanings of the other words that you know in the sentence. That's how we learn naturally, and therefore it's better for you to learn words in a well thought out pedagogy, which is a methodology or teaching technique. And for that, I would strongly advise you to download our vocabulary app and find out what is the right way for you to build your vocabulary and learn words for your exam and even after your exam. After all, vocabulary is a skill in life, and it will help you when you write or when you publish articles and so on. So it's good to have vocabulary and for you to understand communication better. So let's get back to our lesson. So far, what do we know? We know that bats are facing a problem, right? This reliance of some kind of dependency is it makes bats vulnerable to sensory traps. So we know so far that bats are facing a problem. Now, you need to actively engage with the text to find the missing elements in the problem structure. Let's recall the elements again. Problem, cause, impact, and solution. These are the 4 elements of a problem structure passage, right? So let's continue to actively read the passage and see whether this passage not only fits into the problem structure, but where's the cause, where's the impact, where's the solution. And once again, remember that it's not necessary that all of these four must be present in a passage. You might have a passage with a problem structure passage which is the problem, cause and impact without a solution. Right? So let's just recap that structure and let's proceed with the second sentence. For instance, so you can clearly see that. For instance, that means it's an indicator word. They're going to give you an example of the claim that was made in the previous point. For instance, if their calls strike smooth horizontal surfaces, whose calls? Well, the bat's calls, obviously. If their calls strike smooth horizontal surfaces, such as water, at an oblique angle, the surface acts like an acoustic mirror from which the bats hardly receive any echo signals. Right? So it says that bats don't receive echo signals from smooth horizontal surfaces. So this is once again giving you a clue as to what the word echolocation might mean. Bats emit signals, their calls, right? Their calls are signals, and then the reflection of these signals, or the echo rather, is what is going to help the bats move. So, and you can see from here that horizontal surfaces cause a problem, and they the impact of the problem is the bats hardly receive the echo signals. Okay, so here is an example of the problem, smooth horizontal surfaces, and they also talk to you about how it impacts the bats. A similar phenomenon, that means it's yet another impact or another example, occurs with smooth vertical surfaces, sometimes with fatal consequences. That means the bats could die. Right? So here again, this is a greater impact because here the bats might even die, and that is caused by smooth vertical surfaces. The fourth sentence says, ornithologists found that bats usually don't recognize a smooth vertical surface until it's too late, initially perceiving it as a hole to fly through. Now this seems to give us a cause for the problem that was identified earlier, right? Well, of course, there is a technical word here, ornithologists, and don't worry, it's some ologists, some sort of scientists, and in this case you might take a good guess that these are probably scientists who study birds, or well, technically the bat is a mammal, but I'll go with that for now. So some ologists found that bats can't recognize smooth surfaces, and they think of these smooth surfaces as a hole to fly through, right? And what happens, but these are not holes, they're a solid surface, so the bats just ram into these surfaces and therefore they might die, which is what the fatal consequences they're talking about. So guess what, now you've understood what the cause of the problem is, right? Why does this problem happen? The smooth vertical surfaces trick bats into thinking they are holes, but actually they are solid surfaces, and therefore the bats might get hurt or die. So we know what the cause of the problem is. So great, we have a problem, there's an impact of the problem, and now we know what the cause of the problem is. Moving on. Experiments involving greater mouse-eared bats show that the animals collided with a smooth panel on the wall, whereas there were no collisions when the panel was on the floor, though some animals attempted to drink from it. So this is very interesting, right? It says that there were no collisions when the smooth panel was on the floor, but when the panel was on the wall, in other words vertical surfaces, there were collisions. The animals collided with the wall, right? And what is interesting about this sentence is that this is a study that is corroborating or further validating whatever they have talked about before. All right, this is not a transition sentence because there is no change, no indicator word or phrase to point to you that the direction of the passage is changing. So the passage is still continuing along the same track, and now it's giving you further evidence that bats do have a problem with smooth surfaces, and it shows that there's a difference between when the smooth surface is a vertical wall, which actually causes the bats to die, versus if the smooth surface were a horizontal surface in which the bats attempt to drink from it, which means and if you could go back to the second sentence where they talked about smooth surfaces, horizontal surfaces such as water. So now you know why the bats attempt to drink from smooth horizontal surfaces laid out on the floor. We have one more sentence in the passage, and let's see if the author provides a solution for the problem in this sentence. Researchers are now calling for measures on buildings with large glass facades at crucial sites such as migratory highways, key foraging habits, or bat colonies. So the fact that the author talks about researchers calling for measures to take certain steps means without actually suggesting what those measures could be. So this indicates that the solution is not really specific to the problem. There are no clear answers, but there are still some solutions, such as some measures that need to be taken on certain buildings that have large smooth vertical surfaces like glass facades, especially at crucial sites such as migratory highways and so on. So while a specific solution is not proposed, we know that the author wants some measures to be taken while constructing buildings, right? So here there is a call for a solution, although an exact solution is not proposed. So now you know that by skimming through a text and focusing on some indicator words, it's good enough for you to get the overall idea of the passage, especially the structure of the passage, right? So this is how you would skim through a passage and identify the structure of the passage. Not necessary to get into tiny little details at this point. Let's focus on the overall structure of the passage. Now it's time for us to find out what could be the matching structure in our list. Well, clearly we have identified that we are looking for a structure that matches problem, impact, greater impact, cause, evidence, call for solution. And like we can clearly see, this is a problem structure passage. So we do know that this passage fits into the problem structure. So remember again that the broad structure need not exactly reflect everything that you have in hand, right? Impact, you don't have a greater impact here, but you have one in the passage. That's okay. But broadly, it goes through problem. There is a cause identified, for the problem. There is an impact of the problem, and there is a call for solution. So we're talking about a problem passage here. So now we have to find the main idea of the passage. Since we already know the structure of the passage, which is a problem structure, it is easy to derive the main idea or the primary purpose of a passage. Now, typically in a problem structured passage, the main idea is about the problem and the solution. But in this case, there's no particular solution that's recommended. So we can say that the main idea is about the problem. Now, what is the problem that the passage is talking about? The main idea of the passage is that reliance on echolocation in the modern world can be dangerous to bats. That's it. Just a few words is all that you need to summarize the main idea of the passage. Now let's also find the tone of the author. Remember, this is one of the important steps when we skim a passage. Now, do you recall the spectrum of the tone? So we've earlier seen that the spectrum of an author's tone can vary from doesn't like it one bit, not okay with it, kind of critical and skeptical, neutral, okay, and likes it so much. Of course, these last two hardly appear on academic passages. So typically your author's tone was going to be one of these three. Now, for the passage that we're talking about, the author's describing a problem faced by bats. Now, does she have any preference on the topic discussed? No, there's no preference, nothing optimistic or appreciative or preference. Does she dislike the topic, critical or skeptical of anything? No. And since we haven't come across any indicator words that reveal the author's opinion that can be placed on either side of the opinion spectrum, we can safely assume that the author's tone is objective. So the author is taking a very neutral stance, just describing the problem, and therefore the author's tone here is objective. Now it's time to take a quick pause and look at the notes that you've made so far. During skimming, we have established that the context of the passage, there's a broad field and a specific topic. Yes. Structure of the passage is a problem structure, and the main idea of the passage is also clear to us, that reliance on echolocation in the modern world can be dangerous to bats, and the tone of the author is objective. So these are the notes that you must make when you have skimmed this passage. Alright, so you don't need to write lots and lots of stuff. You just need to write this little thing here, and then the main idea, what we've written here, and that the tone of the author is objective. And this is sufficient for us to confidently start answering the questions on this passage. You do not need to write down any of the other details given in the passage. Alright, only the stuff which is given here in blue right here, all of this is what you want to write down. Now that we have clearly written down the context, the structure, the main idea, and the tone of the passage, we are ready to start answering questions on the passage. Let's look at question 1 first. Which of the following best describes the organization of the passage? So, the first thing I would like to point out is that we do not have to look at the answer choices at this time. Alright? This is not at all necessary for us. It's among the last steps. And what we actually have to do is just look at the notes that we had made in terms of our context, the structure, the main idea, and the tone, and then use that information to answer this question. Now, what are the steps involved in answering a question? We've already done the skimming. So first we have to understand what the question wants us to do. Let's read the question again. Which of the following best describes the organization of the passage? Organization of a passage basically means the structure of a passage. So the question is simply asking us how the passage is organized. In other words, the question wants us to identify the structure of the passage. And guess what? We have already identified the structure of the passage while we skimmed the passage. So there's nothing really for us to locate here, and we already know that the structure of the passage is a problem structure, and we know what are the different stages in a problem structured passage. So now we can directly proceed to the next step. So remember, this is what we had identified in our passage reading when we skimmed it, that the passage structure has a problem that it's identifying, then a couple of examples of the impact of this problem and why the problem occurs, in other words, the cause, some evidence for this, and finally a call for a solution. So we are clear about this. This is there in our notes, and therefore this is the structure of the passage. Now it's time to look at the answer choices and eliminate them one by one. Choice A says, a fact is stated, alright, a process is outlined, and specific details of the process are described. Well, this is not related to the passage, because even though it starts with a fact, there is no process that the passage talks about. So choice A cannot be correct. Now let's move on to choice B. A problem is introduced. Sounds good so far. The cause is analyzed and a redressive measure is offered. Now this perfectly fits our structure because yes, we have a problem, we have the cause is analyzed, and there's a call for solution. So this actually follows our structure. So I'm very tempted to go with B, but let's still look at C and make sure that C is not the right answer. C says, an issue is discussed. That's correct. There is an issue in this passage that starts with, a theory is proposed to explain the issue. All right, so far so good. And the problems with the theory are analyzed. Just because the word problem is there doesn't mean this is it's the same as this problem. All right, because we are not analyzing any theories, any problem with the theory. The passage does not talk about why the theory of how bats are being misled and why is wrong. Okay, it doesn't point to any gaps in this theory. The passage, in fact, accepts this theory. It accepts the cause as valid, and it even gives evidence for this cause. So do not fall for this trap. There is no analysis of the theory in this passage, right? So C cannot be the answer, and therefore B is the correct answer. Just a quick note here, this specific question has only 3 answer choices for teaching purposes, but the actual questions that you will encounter on the GRE, this type of question will have 5 answer choices. All right, but I want to give you a clear understanding of how you go about identifying the correct answer choice in a structured question. So that's why we are doing it this way. Let's move on to the second question, and this question says, in the passage the author is primarily concerned with. Primarily concerned with means it's a main idea question, right? So there's nothing much to locate here. Let's understand the question. The author is primarily concerned with. Therefore, when we simplify the question, it's basically asking, what's the purpose of the passage? What's the author concerned about? All right, what's the main thing that the author is writing about? So let's now move on to the different steps involved in answering the question. There's nothing to locate here because it's a general broad question, and we have already made these nice little notes. So we know that the we can already now go to the anticipate step, right? Because we have already arrived at the main idea of the passage. So just look at our notes and don't get too confused between main idea and primary purpose. Remember, they both go hand in hand. The main idea is the answer to the question, what is the author saying in the passage? And the primary purpose is the answer to the question, why has the author written the passage? And they both go hand in hand. Our duty is not to try and draw a watertight distinction between them. All right. So this question is essentially asking us to identify the purpose of the passage. What is the author primarily concerned with, right? What is the problem and what's the solution and so on. So this is something that we already know. It's right here. What the author is talking about is that reliance on echolocation in the modern world can be dangerous to bats. And the why of the problem is the fact that the smooth surfaces in the modern world cause the problem to bats. So you can see how much of an overlap there is between the main idea and the primary purpose. So let's not break our head about trying to distinguish them. The point is we need to know what the main idea and the primary purpose of the passages is. So using this, we can anticipate the answer, and this will help us solve the question. So the main idea of the passage is that there's a problem that bats are facing as a result of certain kinds of surfaces. So now when you actually start eliminating the answer choices one by one, you will find that you'll find that it becomes much easier because you've already anticipated what the answer could be, right? This is the why of the passage. So in the passage, the author is primarily concerned with choice A, illustrating the principle behind echolocation calls. That's not true. The author does not discuss the principle behind echolocation, how echolocation works. That's not what is discussed here. So A is incorrect. Let's look at choice B, demonstrating how the inclination of a surface influences how bats perceive the surface. Well, the author does talk about smooth and vertical and horizontal surfaces, which could be something about the inclination, but the author has not written the purpose just to show how the inclination affects how bats perceive the surfaces. So this is a little iffy for me. Let's come back to it and let's hope that C is a better and more concrete answer choice. C says the author is primarily concerned with highlighting an inadvertent adverse impact that smooth surfaces have on the movements of bats. Now this sounds like gold. This is bingo, because the passage essentially, the author is trying to say that smooth surfaces in the modern world cause problems for bats. So inadvertent adverse impact. Inadvertent means an unexpected impact. Adverse is a negative impact. And these smooth surfaces in the modern world do cause problems to bats. They have an adverse or a negative impact on the movement of bats. So C is the correct answer choice. It perfectly matches the Y that we have come up with. Now let's go to another question in this passage. And this question basically says, the last sentence has which of the following functions in the passage? How interesting. It's basically asking you what is the function of the last sentence of the passage. What's the purpose of this sentence? But again, we don't have to worry because we have already understood that the function, we've already written down the function of every single sentence in the passage. And we know from our notes that the last sentence of the passage is basically calling for a solution. So the function of the last sentence in the passage is to call for a solution. So now that we have anticipated what the answer can be, right? We know that it's calling for a solution. It's calling for steps that needed to be taken to solve the problem faced by bats. Let's now eliminate the answer choices one by one. Choice A says that the last sentence of the passage, the function of the last sentence of the passage is to refer to a potential step taken to mitigate the problem stated earlier. Now, this could be a possible answer because it is talking about a step that can be taken to solve. Mitigate means to redress or solve or find a solution to the problem stated earlier. Okay, let's look at choices B and C as well. Choice B says that the last sentence provides evidence that supports the results from the experiments mentioned in the preceding sentence. Now, this is not correct. The last sentence does not provide evidence. That was a previous sentence. The last sentence is basically calling for a solution to solve the problem. So, B is incorrect. And look at C. The function of the last sentence in the passage is that it states the most important reason for the vulnerability mentioned in the passage. No, it does not talk about the most important reason for the vulnerability. It calls for a step to solve the problem. All right, so choice A is correct. The last sentence of the passage refers to a potential step to solve the problem. So just to quickly recap whatever that we have learned so far, we have understood today that GRE passages can be categorized broadly in terms of 5 different structures: the argument, the problem, transition, debate, and describe. Today we worked on a problem structured passage, right? And we will see more examples of other structures of passages that conform to other structures as we continue with our course. We also looked at how you could use the function of a sentence to arrive at the structure. And we learned how to read actively and anticipate the structure of the passage and the rest of the functions of the sentences once you've identified. All right. So we use this also to solve the questions asked on a particular passage. So I hope today's class gave you a clear picture of how you can use the method, the formula of how to approach reading comprehension passages, and how you can use structures to correctly answer reading comprehension passage questions on the GRE.